In 1889 Newport, a famed socialite vanished into thin air. Scandal, secret affairs, and a cover-up so daring it stayed hidden, until now. What really happened behind those grand walls? This is the untold story. If you love true mysteries from the past, hit subscribe and ring that bell now. Meet Eleanor Carrington, born into Newport's wealthiest dynasty in 1868. From her earliest years, she dazzled at society events, her charisma and elegance drawing admiration and envy in equal measure. As she grew, so did her reputation. At lavish summer balls she moved with grace, in silk gowns, dazzling jewels, the belle of every soiree. But behind the smiles lay rumblings of something darker. Rumors whispered behind polite glances, secret rendezvous with influential men, stolen glances in hidden corridors. Some said she courted scandal more passionately than suitors. In Newport's elite circles, appearance was everything. Eleanor's boldness was seen as defiance. While some admired her independence, others whispered that she was becoming dangerous. In early 1889, a maid discovered letters hidden beneath Eleanor's bed, letters filled with passion, regret, and threats. The handwriting wasn't hers. Her fiancé, Jonathan Blackwell, heir to a shipping fortune, was notably absent from social functions that spring. Some claimed he knew something terrible. The night she vanished, Eleanor attended a masquerade. Witnesses recall she left early, unaccompanied, unsettled, and looking over her shoulder. By morning, she was gone. A fisherman later reported seeing a woman in white by the cliffs, hours before sunrise. He never saw her face. The town buzzed with panic. Police combed beaches and woods. Volunteers scoured every path. But Eleanor had vanished without a trace. Interrogations began. Maids, friends, suitors, all questioned. But their stories were inconsistent. Secrets ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Then, a breakthrough. Her personal diary, hidden behind a loose stone in the fireplace. It hinted at a secret affair and a coded warning, if I vanish, it wasn't by choice. The Carrington family clamped down. Reporters were turned away. Rumors say they burned some of her belongings, and perhaps more than that. Despite the silence, the Newport Herald ran the story. Headlines screamed, "Heiress vanishes," while the city's elite urged the paper to retract. Society was divided. Some blamed Eleanor. Others blamed Jonathan. But no one could explain the blood-stained glove found near the cliffs. Then, weeks later, a sighting. A woman matching Eleanor's description spotted boarding a train in Philadelphia with a man no one recognized. Authorities arrived too late. The couple was gone. But a single item left behind, her silver locket, containing 2 locks of hair and a torn photo. By the late 1800s, Newport, Rhode Island, had become the summer playground of America's wealthiest families. Marble mansions towered over the coastline, filled with the latest European imports, crystal chandeliers, gold leaf ceilings, and servants trained in European etiquette. But beneath the glitz and gowns, Newport was a pressure cooker. Women like Eleanor Carrington were born into privilege, but expected to follow strict rules, marry well, bear children, and never cause scandal. Eleanor, however, saw her world differently. Educated in Paris, she read poetry, philosophy, and political theory, subjects frowned upon in her circle. She questioned everything, the purpose of marriage, the boundaries of class, even the definition of love. She was a rose among roses, but one that threatened to grow thorns. The more she spoke her mind, the more her family and society tightened their grip. Her freedom, it seemed, was just an illusion, wrapped in silk and diamonds. Jonathan Blackwell was Newport's golden boy, son of a shipping tycoon, raised in a life of discipline and legacy. On paper, he was Eleanor's perfect match. Tall, handsome, and poised, he had the approval of both families. But Jonathan harbored his own secrets. Whispers followed him from his time in London, an affair with an opera singer, gambling debts, and one incident too scandalous to publish. Despite it all, Eleanor remained devoted, at least publicly. Privately, her diary entries show frustration. She described him as cold, performative, obsessed with control. Some entries even hinted at fear. When she disappeared, Jonathan showed little emotion. He declined public interviews and kept to his estate. Some said he was grieving in private. Others believed he had something to hide. When asked directly if he thought Eleanor was dead, he simply replied, "She made her choice." The cryptic tone would fuel theories for decades. The hidden letters found beneath Eleanor's bed shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Some were signed only with an initial, R. Others were unsigned entirely, but the handwriting, elegant, confident, and distinctly male, was unmistakable. They spoke of secret meetings at moonlight, stolen kisses behind curtains, and promises to run away. But as the months progressed, the tone darkened. One letter read, "If you tell anyone, they'll never find you." Historians believe these letters point to a man outside her class, a servant, journalist, or perhaps someone married. But the letters themselves were never made public. The Carrington family had them locked away in a private vault, until 1971, when a descendant leaked 3 of them to a tabloid. The scandal reignited public interest in the case, sparking the first modern reinvestigation. Who was R? And what did he have to do with her vanishing? Eleanor's personal diary was discovered weeks after her disappearance, hidden in a fireplace behind a loose stone, one only she and her childhood maid knew about. The entries began with typical musings, parties, society gossip, her dreams of traveling. But as the pages turned, her tone shifted. She wrote of being followed, of arguments with Jonathan, and of discovering things not meant for her eyes. One entry simply read, "If I vanish, know it was not my will." But what caught the attention of investigators most were her symbols, small marks next to certain names, passages with capital letters at odd intervals. A linguistic professor later concluded the diary contained a cipher. When decoded, one section referenced a place called Wanderer's Point, a nickname for a hidden cove used by smugglers decades earlier. A place where, legend said, people disappeared. Wanderer's Point sat on the edge of the estate grounds, accessible only at low tide through a narrow, jagged trail. Locals believed it cursed. The site of shipwrecks, pirate dealings, and perhaps murders. When authorities searched it in the days following Eleanor's disappearance, they found a torn piece of satin caught on a rusted hook embedded in the rocks. It matched the color of her gown. But no footprints, no blood, no other clues. Just a solitary cove carved into stone, its waves crashing endlessly, as if guarding its secrets. Later divers, decades later, discovered an old wooden box in the cove's shallow floor, rotted, but containing strands of blonde hair and a rusted ring engraved with the initials ECB, Eleanor Carrington Blackwell. What was Eleanor doing at Wanderer's Point? Was she meeting someone, or trying to escape? Martha Whitley, Eleanor's personal maid since age 13, was the only servant still loyal to her at the time of her disappearance. At first, she remained silent, honoring what she called a deathbed promise. But 6 years later, on her own deathbed, Martha revealed that on the night Eleanor vanished, she heard raised voices echoing through the East Wing, an argument between Eleanor and a man. She insisted it was not Jonathan. She said Eleanor screamed, "You'll ruin everything," followed by what she believed was the sound of breaking glass. Moments later, she saw a man in a dark coat flee through the garden toward the sea. Martha reported it to the family, but was told to stay quiet, or lose her position and her pension. She claimed she stayed silent out of fear and guilt until the end. Her confession, recorded by a nurse and notarized, reignited the case in 1895, just as the trail grew cold again. Following Martha's statement, the list of suspects grew beyond Jonathan. 3 men stood out, each with connections to Eleanor, and each with something to lose. First, Henry Wycliffe, a journalist known for romanticizing the elite. He was rumored to have been infatuated with Eleanor, often seen sketching her during public outings. Second, Dr. Isaac Romer, the family physician. He had unrestricted access to the estate and, allegedly, Eleanor's confidence. His journal, later published, hinted at medicating a patient against their will. Third, Charles Morton, a family friend and businessman involved in shady land deals. He had been pressuring Eleanor's father to push her into a strategic marriage that would benefit his holdings. Each man had motive. Each had access. But none had an alibi strong enough to remove suspicion. The deeper investigators looked, the more tangled Eleanor's world became. In 1912, during renovations of the Carrington estate, workers uncovered a sealed-off chamber in the east wing, hidden behind bookshelves and bricked over. The room was small, windowless, and eerily preserved. Inside was a faint perfume scent, a single rocking chair, a cracked mirror, and a broken hair comb that matched a set known to belong to Eleanor. But more disturbingly, the walls were covered in handwritten passages. Not in Eleanor's hand, but someone else's. Phrases like, "She doesn't obey," and "Silence is loyalty," were scrawled in overlapping layers. Experts believe the room may have been used to confine Eleanor, at least temporarily, or as a place she fled to, perhaps mentally broken, physically trapped. But no records of the room existed. Not in blueprints. Not in servant logs. Who created it? And who was it meant for? The discovery deepened the mystery, and added a sinister new theory: imprisonment. After Eleanor's disappearance, whispers began about a secret society operating in Newport, a clandestine circle of elite women fighting for independence and autonomy in a world run by men. Known only as the Whisper Society, their meetings were rumored to take place in private libraries, church basements, and even boats anchored off the coast. Eleanor was allegedly one of its most vocal members. Letters recovered from a fellow member, Lillian Adair, refer to EC as someone who inspired us all with her defiance and wit. Some theorize that Eleanor's disappearance was orchestrated by this society to protect her from a forced marriage or even a potential honor killing. Others suggest the group was dismantled by male elites once it was exposed. But no arrests were made, and no formal record of the society remains, only coded letters and cryptic symbols carved into stone benches and graves. Jonathan Blackwell lived another 38 years after Eleanor's disappearance, but never remarried, never wrote memoirs, and rarely left his estate. In his final years, he was seen wandering the cliffs where Eleanor vanished, talking to himself, clutching a pocket watch that supposedly held her portrait. Servants reported him screaming her name during storms and burying something near the family chapel at night. Upon his death in 1927, his will left everything to a foundation for the anonymous preservation of a great legacy. In a hidden drawer of his writing desk, a letter addressed to E was found. It read, "You were always free. I only wished you'd chosen me instead." Was it guilt, madness, or something deeper? Some say Jonathan never recovered because he never truly knew what happened. Others believe he knew exactly, and kept it buried. In 1931, 4 years after Jonathan Blackwell's death, the Carrington family lawyer received an unmarked envelope. Inside was a single letter, postmarked from New Orleans. It read, "I do not forgive what was done, but I am alive. I hope this brings closure. E.C." The handwriting bore striking resemblance to Eleanor's, and forensic experts of the day confirmed it matched samples from her youth. The Carrington family dismissed it as a cruel hoax. But newspapers got hold of the story, and soon the public was captivated once again. Could Eleanor have survived? Had she truly escaped? The letter ignited the second wave of public obsession with the case, dubbed by papers as the heiress who would not die. Investigators rushed to Louisiana, but found no leads. Whoever sent the letter disappeared just as quickly. In 1948, a woman wearing a faded red shawl arrived in Newport, claiming to be Eleanor Carrington. She was in her 80s, walked with a cane, and spoke in an aristocratic accent that matched Newport's upper class. She said she had faked her disappearance to escape a forced marriage, and had spent decades in hiding, moving from city to city under different names. Reporters called her the Woman in Red, and for weeks she was the talk of Rhode Island. Some family members were convinced. Others were furious. Her DNA could not be confirmed, and without photos from Eleanor's later years, no one could say for sure. Eventually, she vanished again, leaving only a red shawl and a single sentence scratched into a mirror, "I told you I'd come home." To this day, believers and skeptics argue over her identity. Was she a desperate imposter, or the real Eleanor, returned too late for forgiveness? During a restoration project in 1962, a team repairing the cliffs behind the Carrington estate unearthed something incredible, a long-forgotten tunnel, bricked up for nearly a century. Old records called it the Carrington Passage, built during the War of 1812 for smugglers moving goods inland unseen. Inside, they found weathered lanterns, water-stained crates, and a woman's shoe, Victorian in style, matching a pair owned by Eleanor. More chillingly, deep in the tunnel was a rotted trunk. Inside, strands of human hair and a silk scarf embroidered with the initials EC. This discovery transformed the case. Was Eleanor killed and hidden there? Or did she use it to flee into the night? Some theorists argue that her disappearance was an inside job, carried out through the tunnel with the help of a trusted insider. Others believe the tunnel holds the answers that no one was ever meant to find. In 1999, amateur historian and podcaster Claire Delmont reopened the Eleanor Carrington case, using newly digitized court archives and letters previously deemed lost. She identified inconsistencies in timelines, servant logs, and witness accounts, suggesting coordinated manipulation of the investigation. Her podcast, Ghost of Newport, went viral. Downloads soared. Public interest reignited, and new theories emerged that Eleanor faked her death, was silenced by a secret society, or even abducted by order of her own family. Delmont's research led to the discovery of a missing page from Eleanor's diary, tucked into the binding of a family Bible at a local church. It read, "They told me I'd be safe, but I don't think I will be. If anyone reads this, know I tried to run." The case, once confined to history books, was now alive again, shared across forums, news outlets, and documentaries. Eleanor's voice echoed into a new century. In 2007, while preparing Carrington family land for a museum expansion, workers uncovered a hidden plot behind the family mausoleum. There, under ivy and moss, lay a small, unmarked grave. Ground-penetrating radar showed a coffin had been buried, likely in the 1890s, but records listed no burial for that date. Inside, they found bones consistent with a woman in her 20s, along with a small silver comb and a locket engraved E. DNA tests were inconclusive, too degraded to match existing samples, but the evidence was enough to suggest a quiet, unannounced burial. Was this Eleanor? Or someone buried in her place? The family issued no public comment. The grave was resealed, this time, with a plaque that read simply, "She was loved and she was lost." For some, it was closure. For others, it was a cover-up, one final twist in a story with no definitive end. In 2011, a handwritten memoir was discovered among the estate of Lillian Adair, a former friend of Eleanor's and suspected member of the Whisper Society. The memoir, titled The Silence We Shared, included a bombshell confession: "Eleanor and I planned her escape. It was the only way to keep her alive." Lillian wrote that Eleanor had feared not just scandal, but actual harm. Her diary entries, it turns out, were written to trigger attention, coded for discovery in case something went wrong. The plan was simple: fake a suicide near the cliffs, escape through the smuggler's tunnel, and board a ship to Europe under a false name. But something went wrong. Lillian never heard from her again. She suspected betrayal, either by Jonathan or someone Eleanor trusted. Lillian ended the memoir with a chilling line: "If Eleanor is dead, her blood is on the hands of more than one man." In 2016, a researcher in Bath, England uncovered a 1901 photograph in a church archive. It showed a woman strikingly similar to Eleanor, sitting with a child in her lap. The woman was listed as Eleanor Whitmore, widow of a British bookseller. No immigration records matched, but the facial structure, birth year, and handwriting on a baptism form were eerily consistent. DNA testing from a descendant of Eleanor Whitmore proved inconclusive due to generational gaps, but the image caused an uproar among Eleanor Carrington truth-seekers. If true, she had not only escaped, but rebuilt her life across the Atlantic, under a new name, with a new family. Skeptics remain, but believers see the photo as final proof that Eleanor lived, and lived free. Private investigator Harold C. Dean had been hired in 1901 by an anonymous source to find Eleanor, dead or alive. His records, long believed destroyed, surfaced in 2018 during the digitization of old Pinkerton files. Dean's notes included travel receipts to Boston, Quebec, and eventually Liverpool. He followed a trail of cash payments, forged documents, and hotel registries signed E.W. In one entry, Dean wrote, "She travels like she's being hunted. Every alias, every border crossing, screams fear, not freedom." He ultimately abandoned the case, claiming he had been warned off. His last memo simply read, "I saw her. She saw me. She smiled, then disappeared again. She didn't want to be found." These files shifted public perception once again. Maybe Eleanor wasn't killed, but didn't want to be rescued. In 1983, a retired Newport servant named Beatrice Holden recorded an interview for a local oral history project. The tape was lost for 35 years, until a university archivist rediscovered it in a mislabeled box. Beatrice, frail but sharp, recounted the night of Eleanor's disappearance with vivid detail. She claimed she saw Eleanor, soaked from the rain, enter the smuggler's passage herself, alone. But her final statement stunned historians. "I was there the next morning. The tunnel was empty, but there were footprints going the other way. Someone had followed her in, and come out alone." Beatrice said she told her employer. She was fired within days. The voice, the emotion, the conviction, left no doubt she believed what she saw. The interview redefined the mystery. If someone followed Eleanor in, who followed her out? Today, more than 130 years after Eleanor Carrington's disappearance, the mystery remains one of the most debated in American history. Each generation rediscovers her with new tools, new theories, technologies, and agendas. To some, she was a victim of patriarchy. To others, a clever escape artist. And to a few, just a story. A legend that grew legs and wandered far from the truth. But every letter, every photo, every whispered confession adds to the legacy. Eleanor Carrington is not simply a missing person. She is a symbol. A symbol of women silenced, of history manipulated, of truth buried beneath wealth and power. As historian Dr. Lydia Monroe said, "We may never know exactly what happened to Eleanor, but the world she escaped from? That we know far too well." In 2020, during the estate sale of a late banking heir linked to the Blackwell family, a private ledger surfaced, thick with transactions dating back to the 1880s. Amid the banking codes and initials were large, unexplained payments issued just days after Eleanor's disappearance. Recipients included 2 police captains, a church caretaker, and a dockmaster. One entry stood out, "Confidential transfer to J.B. for discretion." Investigators believe this was Jonathan Blackwell himself, potentially moving hush money to keep something buried. Why would he need to pay off police, clergy, and port authorities? The theory emerged that Eleanor's disappearance had not been a lone escape or act of violence, but a coordinated cover-up, facilitated by the very institutions meant to protect her. This ledger, now held in the Newport Historical Society, is considered one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the case. With growing doubt about Eleanor's escape, some researchers proposed an even darker theory, that she never made it out of the smuggler's tunnel at all. According to investigator Amelia Harrow, a structural report from the early 1900s revealed part of the passage collapsed weeks after Eleanor disappeared, and may have done so earlier. Using sonar mapping, Harrow's team identified an inaccessible chamber behind the rubble. Could it contain Eleanor's remains? Or signs of a trap set deliberately? This theory suggests Eleanor's death was not by accident or suicide, but a planned execution, with the tunnel collapse used to erase evidence. Efforts to excavate the chamber were halted by local preservationists, citing instability. But public pressure is mounting. If there is something hidden behind those walls, it stayed hidden long enough. In 1978, a retired nurse named Evelyn Brockton contacted a local journalist claiming she had treated Eleanor, under a false name, at a sanitarium outside Providence in the early 1900s. She described a frail, well-spoken woman who refused to give her real name, but once whispered, "I wasn't supposed to survive the tunnel." Brockton arranged an interview with the press. But days before it happened, she disappeared. Her car was found parked at a train station. No ticket, no luggage, no trace. Her apartment was ransacked, but nothing stolen. To this day, Evelyn's disappearance remains unexplained. Some call it coincidence. Others say she knew something too important. Her case is now considered part of the greater mystery, a story within a story, and one of the most chilling indicators that someone, even a century later, didn't want Eleanor's truth revealed. Delivered to the Carrington Family Trust in 2022, a final letter, preserved in a sealed box marked to be opened upon final request. The handwriting was old but fluid. The content was haunting. To those who read this, I do not seek redemption, only to be remembered by the wind and the sea. I was not taken. I fled. For love, for breath, for my name. Let no man claim me. I was never his. Was it real? Handwriting experts say yes. The phrasing matches Eleanor's style. The paper, a match to 1890s Paris stationery. No one knows who sent it. It was postmarked from a private P.O. box leased by a lawyer who died decades ago. But the message was clear. If this was Eleanor, she had the last word. And if not, someone wanted it to sound that way. Today, Eleanor Carrington's story lives on, in books, documentaries, podcasts, and whispers across the marble halls of Newport. Her face appears on murals, her letters quoted in college lectures on gender, wealth, and power. What began as a disappearance has become a movement. For some, she's the victim of a patriarchal system that silenced inconvenient women. For others, she's the heroine of her own liberation story. No court ever ruled on her fate. No grave bears her confirmed name. But Eleanor's presence is felt in every mystery that challenges power and demands truth. In the end, perhaps she was both prisoner and architect. Both victim and escape artist. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what she wanted. In 2023, a team of forensic anthropologists from Brown University was granted rare access to the Carrington grounds, under pressure from public petitions and historical advocacy groups. Using 3D mapping, drone LiDAR, and soil resonance, they began scanning the property for signs of unmarked graves or hidden structures. Within weeks, they uncovered 3 subterranean voids not listed on any estate map, one beneath the east garden, one under the stables, and another beneath the cliff chapel. Could these be burial chambers, secret passageways, or architectural remnants long buried under privilege and time? Locals say the ghosts of Eleanor's story stirred again. Candlelight vigils were held. Paranormal investigators attempted contact. But one thing was clear. The past was no longer buried. It was waiting. One name consistently reappeared in suppressed documents. Senator Arthur D. Blackwell, nephew of Jonathan Blackwell, and rising political star in the early 1900s. A staunch defender of family values and Eastern tradition, Arthur was heavily involved in suppressing gossip, lawsuits, and publications involving the Carringtons. Leaked letters from his office showed attempts to bribe newspaper editors, silence former servants, and even block early film adaptations of Eleanor's story. Some speculate his influence was why investigations remained stagnant for decades, protected not just by wealth, but political muscle. Historians now believe Arthur may have played a direct role in hiding, or rewriting, the truth. The case was no longer just about Eleanor. It was about legacy, control, and the machinery built to erase uncomfortable women from history. In late 2023, a living relative of Eleanor's, her great-great-niece, submitted a DNA sample to an international ancestry project. The results returned something shocking. A near-identical match was found to an undocumented burial in southern France, a woman listed as Eleanor Dumouriez, deceased 1937, age 69. French records showed she was born in Rhode Island, had no family history, and was buried quietly in a vineyard cemetery. Local lore had long claimed she was an American runaway who arrived by sea in 1890. The Carrington Trust, once hostile to exhumation, has now approved a DNA match attempt. If confirmed, this could be the final physical proof that Eleanor not only escaped, but lived the rest of her life in peace. In the attic of the Carrington estate, now partially converted into a public museum, curators discovered a locked travel trunk, misfiled among shipping crates from the 1920s. Inside was a treasure trove, letters from Eleanor post-dated 1890, addressed to a woman named Lisette in Paris. She wrote about books, gardening, and the sea. But one letter was different. My name no longer belongs to them. I do not write for memory. I write for breath. If you read this, burn it. The letters were authenticated, and handwriting confirmed. But the last page was stained, water-damaged, some words illegible. Curators debate whether to preserve the letters or respect Eleanor's final request, that they never be read. The trunk remains sealed in glass, a reminder that even now, she keeps some part of her story to herself. In 1952, a 10-year-old girl named Annabelle Trask swore she saw Eleanor Carrington, older, graceful, and dressed in gray, walking along the beach near the old Carrington boathouse. No one believed her. But she held on to the image for her entire life. She said the woman turned, smiled, and put a finger to her lips before disappearing into the trees. Annabelle passed in 2024. In her belongings, her grandson found a sketch she made as a child, a woman's silhouette walking away into the mist. In the corner, a note, "I think she was happy. It may have been imagination, or it may have been the final sighting." Whatever the case, Eleanor left behind more than mystery. She left behind traces of herself in the lives and dreams of those who came after. Imagine the night of June 3, 1889. A storm begins to rise over Newport's waters. The ocean thrashes, the sky splits with lightning. Inside the Carrington estate, all is still, until one window creaks open on the east wing. A figure moves silently through the hallway, dressed in muted gray, not the bright white of her public ball gown. She carries nothing but a pouch, a letter, and the locket containing her mother's hair. She moves through the garden, past the roses she once tended. Her slippers soaked. Her breathing shallow. At the edge of the cliff, hidden in the shadow of the cove, she finds the tunnel. A lantern flickers inside. Waiting. Somewhere in the distance, a man calls out her name, but she does not turn back. Within the hour, a dockmaster in Providence logs the passage of a small freight boat, registered to a French trader. A passenger manifest lists only 4 names. The last is erased, smudged by rain. We'll never know if Eleanor truly boarded that ship. But if she did, it was not in fear. It was in defiance. She wasn't running away. She was running toward something. Freedom, identity, perhaps even love. This isn't just a theory. It's a recreation, based on the timeline from the recovered journal, dock records, and the confirmed ship logs. And in this version of history, the one so carefully buried, Eleanor Carrington chose herself. The smuggler's tunnel wasn't built for beauty. It was narrow, dank, suffocating. Built in 1812, it moved gunpowder during war, rum during Prohibition, and in 1889, a woman who no longer belonged to her name. The walls bore symbols, chalk marks from past smugglers, initials etched in rusted blades, candles melted into stone. At the halfway point, Eleanor stopped. Her journal entry, later deciphered, reads, "I lit the candle. I whispered goodbye. The wind answered nothing." Whether she passed through alone, or was met by a guide, remains debated. But one thing is certain, she never returned through that tunnel. In 2025, a new 3D scan revealed a hollow chamber just beyond the main exit, large enough to hide 2 people and a small boat. In the chamber, forensic dusting revealed ash, hair fibers, and the residue of perfume oil consistent with 19th-century French imports. This chamber was never meant to be found. And yet, it tells more than any spoken account. She waited. She escaped. And the tunnel, once a passage for contraband, became the artery of her rebirth. The same tunnel where smuggling once corrupted the coast, gave birth to her second life. In 2025, a sealed envelope was unearthed in the wall of a Paris bookstore, long since converted from what was once a boarding house. It was addressed in English, "To whoever tells my story with care." Inside was a letter, brittle with age but intact. Its content, dictated in perfect cursive, finally gave Eleanor her own voice. "I have not been a ghost. I have been a woman living in plain sight, unseen. I planted lavender, taught school, and kissed the sea each morning. I was not stolen. I left before they could. Tell them that." The letter is now preserved in the Bibliothèque Historique in Paris. Historians date it between 1905 to 1910. No signature. No initials. But tucked inside was a pressed white rose, the same kind Eleanor once cultivated in Newport's garden. Some argue it's a forgery, crafted by romantic mythmakers. Others say it's the final piece of truth she left behind. Regardless, for those who believe, it represents something priceless, the restoration of a woman's voice after a century of others speaking for her. And in that quiet Parisian room, Eleanor spoke again, on her terms, in her time. The greatest trick Eleanor Carrington ever pulled was convincing the world she was gone. She played the part society wrote for her until the night she refused the role. Born into wealth, trained for grace, expected to marry, bear heirs, and stay silent. But behind the velvet gowns and piano recitals, she studied escape. Witnesses recall how she observed everything: servant schedules, estate flaws, the tides. She memorized the terrain. Psychologists today call it survival cognition, the process of preparing one's own vanishing act. Her disappearance wasn't a fluke. It was performance, one staged inside the world's most gilded theater. From the forged letters to the misdirection at the cliffs, from the bribes to the diary codes, this wasn't chaos. It was choreography. And the audience, the public, the press, the patriarchy, what they called tragedy, was actually the opening act of her freedom. She wrote herself out of the script. And that, perhaps, was her boldest rebellion. Every year, thousands visit Newport. They walk the cliff walk, tour the Carrington estate, peer into the ballroom where Eleanor once danced. But some say her presence remains, not in the haunting sense, but in something deeper. Visitors report feeling watched in the East Wing. Some find hand mirrors tilted in impossible directions. Others claim to hear the distant sound of piano keys, playing a melody no one recognizes. A caretaker once found a daisy placed on the windowsill Eleanor favored. No cameras, no tours had passed through that day. Is it all coincidence? Theater of the mind? Or perhaps Eleanor, the strategist, the performer, the escape artist, left behind a trail that never really ends. Maybe she watches each theory unfold with quiet amusement. And maybe, just maybe, she intended it that way. Not for closure, but for immortality. After Eleanor's disappearance, locals whispered of a Carrington family curse, a dark legacy of pride, silence, and control. In the decades that followed, tragedy did seem to follow her bloodline. Jonathan's cousin died young in an unexplained fire. A grandchild was institutionalized under unclear circumstances. Family portraits were removed. Eleanor's name was never spoken aloud in public again. Psychologists today believe it wasn't a curse, it was generational trauma. A cycle of repression and secrecy passed from one child to the next. But folklore thrives where history leaves silence. Tour guides speak of a lady of the East Wing, a woman in gray who appears by the windows, always facing the sea. Skeptics laugh. Believers nod. But whether or not Eleanor haunts the house, her story haunts the legacy. The real curse? Not magic, but the decision to erase her, and the truth that refused to stay buried. Since the publication of Eleanor's letters and journals, thousands of people around the world have written to her. Letters arrive each week at the Carrington Archive. They begin, "Dear Eleanor, to the woman who refused, to the one who vanished." Some are short, "You helped me leave." Others are long, pages of heartbreak, solidarity, survival. Teenagers share their struggles. Grandmothers recall marriages they escaped. Survivors of silence tell her that her story gave them permission to speak. Archivists now keep a collection called Letters to the Lost. It fills 7 boxes. None of them expect Eleanor to read them. But perhaps that's not the point. When history erases someone, remembrance becomes rebellion. And Eleanor's absence, her vanishing, became a space others could step into. A mirror, a prayer, a revolution with no need for witnesses. In 2026, while restoring a damaged Carrington family portrait, archivist Melinda Ruiz noticed something unusual. Behind the canvas, tucked between the backing wood and oil paint, was a folded piece of paper sealed in wax. It bore the symbol of the Whisper Society, a closed eye. The note was unsigned, but written in Eleanor's cipher. Once decoded, it read, "I am not art. I am not myth. I am the unfinished line they painted over." Inside the same frame were faint sketches of maps, initials, and what appeared to be the tunnel's original blueprint. Melinda's team believes Eleanor or an ally planted the message, knowing that art restorers, one day, might uncover it. Her message was clear: don't look at the surface. Don't believe the painting. Truth isn't in the portrait. It's in the frame. Another reminder that Eleanor's story wasn't just hidden, it was deliberately buried in places only curiosity could reach. In a village near the French Alps, elderly locals speak of a quiet woman who arrived in 1890 and never left. They called her Madame Blanche, White Lady, because of her pale dresses and withdrawn smile. She tended a vineyard. She taught village children to read. She never married, but wore a locket and wrote long letters no one was allowed to read. When she died in 1937, she asked for no headstone, only a lavender bush. In 2024, a Carrington historian visited the site. Under the bush's roots, they found a rusted box. Inside, a small mirror, a pressed white rose, and a ring inscribed EC. Locals now call her the American Ghost. But if this was Eleanor, then her final act was peace. Not drama. Not escape. But solitude. She did not return to reclaim her name. She didn't need to. She had already reclaimed herself. Across centuries, Eleanor Carrington has become more than a mystery. She is a canvas for every silenced voice. A cipher. A signal fire. She did not disappear to vanish. She disappeared to begin. Begin a story no one else would dare write for her. Whether she fled to France, died in the tunnel, or vanished into myth, her story survives not in answers, but in echoes. In every woman who reclaims her name. Every survivor who walks away from expectation. Every soul who dares to say, "No, I will not be what you wrote for me." She was never merely lost. She was never forgotten. She is not buried under marble. She walks beside every woman who refuses to disappear. And that is how Eleanor Carrington never died. Without Eleanor, the Carrington estate felt hollow. Servants recalled the halls growing quieter, curtains drawn tighter, laughter replaced by long silences. Jonathan hosted no more parties. Her father rarely left his study. Her mother took to bed, surrounded by letters no one was allowed to read. Rooms once filled with music were locked. Mirrors were turned to face the walls. Over time, the house itself seemed to sag, as though mourning her absence, or perhaps recoiling from guilt. Visitors later said the air in the East Wing was heavy, like the building was trying to forget something, or someone. But what the house tried to erase, time preserved. In every locked drawer, every scratched floorboard, every faded perfume trace on the linens, the house without Eleanor was not a monument, it was a tomb built by denial. A hollow fortress that tried to forget a woman who refused to be forgotten. Eleanor was born with everything: wealth, beauty, education. But from the start, none of it belonged to her. Her name was a label for property. Her face a symbol of status. Her future arranged before she could spell the word. She was not a daughter. She was a debutante. Not a person, a performance. The expectations wrapped around her like corsets, beautiful, suffocating. And yet she smiled. She danced. She played her part, until she didn't. In every letter we've recovered, there's one common theme. I want to be mine. Not theirs. Not his. Not society's. Hers. That may be why she vanished, not to escape a place, but to reclaim a name. One not written in headlines or family trees, but whispered in peace. Spoken in her own mirror. Eleanor Carrington didn't disappear. She took herself back. What followed Eleanor's disappearance wasn't just mystery, it was silence. Official reports were vague. Obituaries listed her missing, presumed dead. The family declined comment. Newspapers quickly moved on. But silence is not nothing. Silence is strategy. To stay silent was to erase doubt. To erase her. And so the silence deepened, in the courtroom, the dinner table, the history books. But silence leaves clues. We find them in cancelled wedding announcements, redacted estate documents, deleted servant records. In the empty spaces where her name once lived. Eleanor's absence became a noise louder than her presence ever was. That silence is the sound of a question no one wanted answered. And the louder we listen to that silence, the more truth it tells. History is written by victors, but myth is written by the forgotten. When Eleanor vanished, facts were scarce, so people filled the gaps with story. A runaway, a ghost, a murder victim, a smuggler's lover, a feminist icon. Each version told us more about the world telling it than the woman herself. Myths aren't lies. They're coded truths. And Eleanor became the myth no one could kill, because she was never just one thing. She was every woman silenced. Every daughter disobedient. Every bride who said no. That's why she lasts. Because Eleanor Carrington didn't just live in history. She lives in every story of a woman who disappears and refuses to stay gone. In one of Eleanor's journals, hidden in a leather cover beneath a false bottom, was a letter with no date. It wasn't addressed to anyone except herself. It began, "If I make it out, if I become someone else, if I survive this, remember who you were before they told you who to be." She writes of memories, riding horses at dusk, laughing with her maid Martha, dancing alone in the hall when no one was watching. She writes of fear, of courage, of wanting to look into the mirror one day and see someone she chose. The last line simply says, "If you are reading this, you did not disappear. You reappeared as yourself." A letter to her future. A time capsule of resistance. Not for history books. For the woman she hoped to become. And maybe, just maybe, did. Behind the Carrington estate, tucked between hedges and stone walls, was a private garden. Eleanor began designing it in 1888. She chose white roses, lavender, and daisies, flowers with no status, no symbolism. "Just what I love," she wrote in her notes. But the garden was unfinished when she vanished. The family abandoned it. For years it grew wild, forgotten. Then, in 1975, a group of college students researching Newport history cleared it, replanted it using Eleanor's designs. Now, it blooms every spring. A sign marks the entrance, the Garden of the Unfinished Woman. Visitors say it's the quietest place on the estate. No guided tours. No cameras. Just silence, flowers, and the wind. Eleanor never saw it complete. But maybe she didn't need to. Maybe it wasn't for her. Maybe it was for us. A place where something once cut short could finish growing. Eleanor lost everything when she walked away. Title, family, safety, identity. But what she left behind was something else entirely. She left questions that forced generations to dig deeper. She left gaps that historians filled with truth. She left pain, yes, but also purpose. In leaving her world behind, she gave others a map out of theirs. She never published a book, made a speech, or signed a manifesto. And yet, she became a quiet rebellion, echoing louder with time. She did not destroy the walls around her. She slipped between them. And because of that, what was taken from her became a gift for the rest of us. Not a scream, not a statue, but something braver. A choice. If Eleanor Carrington did live out her life in France, she likely changed her name. Records suggest she used Eleanor Whitmore, Elena Blanche, and finally, Ellie Dumas. None were legally traceable, but all were found near letters, photographs, and poems linked to her story. Her final gravestone, if it exists, may carry none of those names. Which raises the question, what is a name? A gift? A brand? A cage? Perhaps the name she chose wasn't one written down at all. Maybe it was a feeling, a memory, a truth spoken only to herself. She never asked the world to call her anything, only to listen when she was no longer speaking. She didn't need a final name. She already had one. Free. History didn't want Eleanor's story. It wanted a cautionary tale. A footnote. A mystery to sell newspapers. But time changes the listener. What we once dismissed as scandal, we now call strength. What we once hid in basements, we now display in glass. Her letters, her diary, her code, once redacted, now restored. Because the world finally became ready. Ready to hear the voice of a woman who refused to be convenient. Ready to accept that not all stories are neat, or moral, or tied with a bow. Some end with questions. Some with gardens. And some, like Eleanor's, end with the world finally catching up to a woman who was always ahead. There's a term in art, the vanishing point. It's where all lines converge, where the eye is drawn, where the subject fades, but the shape remains. Eleanor became our vanishing point. Her story is not just one line, it's thousands, all leading to the same place. The question of who we are when no one is watching. She did not vanish in the night. She vanished into meaning, into every mirror that dares to reflect something unapproved, into every silence we now fill with truth. She is not where the story ends. She's where it begins. Not the vanishing point, the reappearing one. In the end, Eleanor Carrington became the most dangerous kind of woman. Not because she betrayed a man. Not because she fled a family. But but because she redefined what it meant to be visible. She refused to be the daughter written into marriage contracts. She refused to be the fiancée used to broker empires. And most of all, she refused to let the world make her disappear in the way it preferred, quietly, obediently, through conformity. Eleanor didn't just leave a room. She left a structure, a lineage, an institution built to silence her. And that's what terrified them. Because when someone born at the top of the world walks away from it, it forces everyone to ask, was that world ever really worthy to begin with? That's why they buried her story. Not because she failed, but because she succeeded in living on her own terms. The Carringtons had money. The newspapers had headlines. But Eleanor? She had freedom. And freedom, once chosen, cannot be erased by time. It is an ember passed from soul to soul, and today it still burns. When historians try to rewrite the erased, they begin in archives, shelves of yellowed pages, silent rooms filled with secrets. Eleanor's story emerged not in a single file, but in fragments, diary scraps, witness notes, censored court ledgers. Each fragment was a whisper, a plea, a resistance encoded in ink. What we call research is really listening. And once we began listening to Eleanor, she wouldn't stop speaking. She appeared in hotel registries in Marseilles, art school attendance logs in Prague, even a women's rights journal in Belgium under the pen name E.C. Bloom. Her voice bent through borders. Her story leaked through the cracks of silence. Not because she sought fame, but because truth, real truth, insists on being found. And for every archive that tried to mislabel her, a new one rose that put her name where it belonged. Eleanor Carrington, no longer lost, but catalogued under resilience, autonomy, legacy, filed not under mystery, but under reclamation. Why does Eleanor matter? Why, more than a century later, do people still read her diary, trace her letters, argue over grainy photographs and forgotten tunnels? Because Eleanor is not just one person. She is archetype. She is the question that lives inside so many of us. What would I become if I stopped performing? What would happen if I walked out of the life written for me? Eleanor is every girl who's been told to smile. Every woman who's been asked to stay quiet. Every soul that's been asked to shrink for someone else's comfort. Her story endures not because it's unique, but because it's universal. And that's the real secret. She never truly disappeared. She became the quiet revolution waiting inside everyone who ever doubted they were allowed to begin again. Eleanor is a name, but she's also a possibility. And that possibility belongs to all of us. Most people live a life. Some become a legacy. But legacies don't begin with monuments. They begin with choices. Eleanor's choice wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It was quiet, calculated, and terrifyingly clear. She chose herself. And in doing so, she set in motion a ripple that would outlast every ballroom, every scandal, every effort to erase her. Her legacy isn't just in the documents recovered or the theories argued. It's in the freedom she modeled. The refusal to remain where she wasn't allowed to be whole. You won't find her name in marble, but you'll find her voice in every page of dissent. Every artist who starts over. Every woman who reclaims the ending of her own story. That's the kind of legacy you can't fake. That's how a person becomes immortal. Not by staying, but by leaving right. A mystery is a question unanswered. But a memory is something carried. Eleanor Carrington began as a mystery, a vanished socialite, a whisper in the Gilded Age. But over time, the question turned inward. Not where did she go, but what did she teach us? We remember her now not because she vanished, but because in that vanishing, she left behind a mirror. And in that mirror, generations have seen themselves, not as missing, but as becoming. She reminds us that stories don't need endings. They need meaning. And meaning is something we write together, across borders, lifetimes, and locked doors. So now, when we say her name, it is no longer in grief. It is in gratitude. Eleanor Carrington, the woman who turned disappearance into presence, forever remembered, because she was never truly gone. There are two kinds of disappearances. The kind where someone is taken, snatched, erased, silenced by force, and the kind where someone chooses to vanish, not to escape justice or fear, but to reclaim something they never had the chance to define, themselves. Eleanor Carrington's disappearance has fascinated generations not simply because she vanished, but because of how she vanished and why. The world she lived in didn't make room for complexity. It demanded performance. She was a daughter, a bride-to-be, a symbol of grace, wealth, and obedience. She was a ribbon placed atop a dynasty. But what happens when a woman, born into every privilege, uses that privilege not to ascend, but to escape? That's where the story truly begins. Because Eleanor didn't vanish into darkness. She vanished into authenticity. In the decades since, we've tried to name her legacy. Was she a feminist hero? A runaway? A victim of conspiracy? The truth is, she may have been all of those things. And none. Because her vanishing act was not about running from the world, but running back to herself. She didn't write a book. She didn't lead a movement. She didn't post a manifesto. But the ripples she created changed the way we ask questions. She gave us permission, quiet, subtle, profound, to imagine a life beyond the roles handed to us. And that's why we remember her. Not for how she vanished, but for how she began. Names are meant to identify us, to capture who we are. But too often, names are used to control. Eleanor Carrington was a name spoken with reverence, money, and status. A name expected to open doors, marry wealth, and sit quietly beside power. But Eleanor refused to let her name own her. She carved her identity from silence, from all the things she was told not to say, not to think, not to feel. That's what made her dangerous. Not her disappearance, but the autonomy behind it. Her silence wasn't submission. It was strategy. She let the world believe she was gone. And in that absence, she claimed the one thing she was never offered in Newport society: choice. Choice to be unknown. Choice to be untraceable. Choice to define her own worth outside of headlines and inheritance. And that's where history failed her. It tried to define her by what she left behind: a glove, a locket, a rumor. But those weren't her identity. They were echoes. Her identity lived in what came after. The school children she taught in France. The poems she mailed under pseudonyms. The quiet vineyard where she signed her name only once, not to prove who she was, but to say, "Here. I lived. I chose." In a world obsessed with proof, she dared to be felt instead of documented. And in doing so, she left behind something more permanent than any stone carving. A name remembered, in silence. Most people think freedom looks like revolution, loud, explosive, headline-worthy. But Eleanor Carrington taught us that real freedom is quieter, slower, often invisible to those who never had to earn it. Real freedom doesn't always come with fanfare. It comes with difficult decisions, quiet mornings, rebuilding a life out of nothing. Imagine what it means to walk away from a name that guarantees you everything: wealth, comfort, protection, and say, "I would rather be unknown than unfree." That's not weakness. That's clarity. And it's the kind of clarity most people are too afraid to chase. Because chasing freedom often means becoming invisible. No recognition. No applause. Just peace. And maybe that's why Eleanor's story touches so many people. Because we live in a world obsessed with being seen. And she chose, deliberately, to be unseen. not as surrender, but as self-preservation. And in doing so, she became more visible than ever. Every woman who stepped away from a toxic home, every person who started over with nothing but their own breath, every soul who's whispered, "I will not be owned." They carry Eleanor's ghost in them. And in that way, her story didn't end. It spread. At some point, Eleanor's story stopped being hers alone. It became ours. Ours to examine, to debate, to learn from. And with that inheritance comes responsibility. The responsibility not to romanticize her pain or reduce her choices to myth, but to listen. To listen to what wasn't said. To listen to what history tried to erase. To listen to the silence between the rumors. Because stories like Eleanor's don't exist just to entertain, they exist to teach. They teach us what society values, what it punishes. They teach us how we treat women who step out of line. They teach us that even centuries later, we are still trying to answer the same question. Who do we become when we refuse to be what they expect? And perhaps most importantly, they teach us that we can begin again. Because Eleanor Carrington didn't give us closure. She gave us permission to disappear from what hurts, to step into the unknown, to write a story that isn't neat, but is true. This story is no longer Eleanor's. It's yours now. And what you do with it, how you carry it forward, that's where the real ending lives. We began this journey searching for one woman, a socialite, a mystery, a ghost. But somewhere along the way, Eleanor Carrington stopped being a figure in a photograph and started becoming a mirror. Not a person, but a question. Not a legacy, but a world. A world where women are not judged by who they marry. A world where silence is not the price of survival. A world where choosing your own life doesn't require permission. Eleanor lived in a time where none of that was allowed. And still, she did it anyway. She lived. She left. She loved, we believe, in secret and in full. She rebuilt herself in shadows and letters. And now, she lives again. In documentaries. In lectures. In voices that rise every time someone says, "I will not be who they say I am." She became a myth not because she was untrue, but because she became more than one version of truth could hold. And so, she became a world built of choices, courage, and vanishing acts that end not in loss, but in liberation. To Eleanor, to the woman who chose herself, to the story that never ends, because stories like hers never should.